Hello everyone, hope you're doing well and staying safe. I was thinking of what I wanted to film today because I was in the mood to film, and unfortunately, and I think this might be the case with a lot of us, I have not been reading a lot lately. Something about the pandemic and being home a lot is making me read less psychologically. Please let me know if you guys are in the same boat and maybe I'll do a video on it. But I was thinking of other things to film, and one video that I've been pushing off filming for a long time because it's a lot of information to cover in a short period of time is on industrial organizational psychology as a whole. If you've been around my channel for a long time, I used to have this series I would occasionally do called Psych Pop, where I would talk about different psychology related topics within my field, industrial organizational psychology. But one video I have never filmed is just on what industrial organizational psychology is, master's versus PhD, salary, what jobs are out there. So this has absolutely nothing to do with the rest of my channel, but there isn't a ton of IO psychology content on YouTube, so I thought it would just be helpful for people in general who are interested in maybe this being a career path for them. So I'll have timestamps down below, but I'm going to talk about first what is industrial organizational psychology, then I'll get into my background in terms of school and work. Then I'll talk about master's versus PhD because that's the big question for a lot of people. And with that, I'll touch on salary differences. Then I'll talk about the different types of jobs that are out there because I think if you're interested in the field, that's something that's definitely very confusing. And then finally, I will talk about some job hunting tips, and I think those are applicable honestly to any job. So first, what is industrial organizational psychology? I have the definition up here because I don't want to accidentally butcher it, but IO psychology, which is what I'll call it for the rest of the video because industrial organizational psychology is a mouthful. It's characterized by the scientific study of human behavior in organizations and the workplace. The specialty focuses on deriving principles of individual, group, and organizational behavior and applying this knowledge to the solution of problems at work. Those of you in the UK or Europe can correct me if I'm wrong, but I have a couple friends in the UK who went to school for this, and over there I think it's called work psychology, which is a lot less of a mouthful and really straightforward. I honestly wish we called it that here. But I came across this pie chart online. I apologize, I have no idea how accurate this is, but I thought it was interesting. And it talks about areas of specialization in psychology. Meaning in general, what I think this is getting at is, say you majored and have your bachelor's in psychology and then you're going on to some type of specialization in grad school or work. So it looks like the biggest chunk, 54%, go into clinical or counseling, and then 6% there at the bottom you can see go into industrial organizational psychology. I'll talk about this a little bit later on when I talk about the different types of jobs in IO psychology, but I think what makes it inherently a little bit confusing is number one, the very wordy title, and then number two, people in this field. You know, when I think of those that I went to grad school with, none of us really walk around and say, "Hi, I'm Katie and I'm an industrial organizational psychologist," because one, people would just stare at you blankly, and number two, generally our job title is not IO psychologist. I've had a bunch of different jobs since grad school and never once has it been IO psychologist. Generally, our title is more relevant to our actual position, and again, I'll talk about that a little bit more in job types. And I guess maybe a good thing to ask yourself is, are you interested in people's lives at work? Are you interested in figuring out ways to improve them, improve engagement, make people more productive and happy in the workplace? So now I'm going to talk a little bit about my background, and this video is not about me, but I thought it would just be helpful for those of you coming across this video to understand some of the work that I've done and my background with school. And I should say up front, I apologize. I like to keep this book review channel very, very separate from my work life, so I don't say any specific names of companies that I've worked at or obviously my school. So apologies, I'm not going to give out personal information like that. But just kind of vaguely, for undergrad, I did a 4-year degree and majored in psychology and minored in Spanish. I took a year off and worked as an English teacher in Spain just because I really wanted to work abroad and didn't know when I would have the chance to do that again. I have videos about that experience up on my channel if you're curious. And then while I was in Spain, I was researching and started applying to grad schools. I think I want to say I applied to 5 IO psychology programs, all master's level, because I knew I did not want to do PhD. And I ended up doing a 2-year full-time in-person, which saying in-person these days sounds really strange, but it was a 2-year full-time in-person master's degree in industrial organizational psychology. A lot of the programs, at least in the US on the master's side, that are full-time are structured sort of in the same way, where it's 2 years and you generally have to have Not with every grad program, at least with mine, you had to have some type of IO or HR internship in between those 2 years during that summer in between. And then I also worked part-time as a graduate assistant during those 2 years. Once I graduated, I worked at a pretty big company and worked in, how do I describe this? If you Google leadership development program or rotational development program, you'll see what I'm talking about. But a lot of big countries, not just in the US, I'm sure it's in other countries as well, they have 2 or 3 year sort of rotational position programs that are within a specific field. So maybe if you went to school for finance, you'd work in a few different finance departments at the company. And then once you graduate, you're in your full-time role, even though you're working full-time the whole time. So the 3 areas I worked in were all relevant for IO psychology, because it was an HR rotational program. So my first one was HR business partner. Then I worked in learning and development. Then I worked in, what was it? Talent management. Those were each 8 months, which if you followed my channel for a while, that's why I was moving so much, because they were moving me to different states. And then following that, I worked for a year in sort of talent and development. We're looking at engagement surveys, the performance review cycle, all that stuff. And then in the middle of the pandemic, there was a lot going on with the culture of that company. I also just will be honest, I wasn't happy with where I was living. I was really, really far from home, and I was just like, I'm getting close to 30. I don't want to be 12 hours from family forever. So I left that job and moved back to the East Coast, and I've been in my current position for about 7 months. And I'm basically a learning and development consulting, so it's a lot of creating and facilitating workshops for clients, administering behavioral assessments and personality assessments, and then talking about the results and facilitating. For an introvert like me, it's a lot of presenting. And if down the road you want me to do, tips for presenting for introverts, definitely feel free to let me know. Okay, so that's all my background. Now we're gonna shift and talk a little bit about master's versus PhD. I will say up front, obviously, as I've already said, I don't have my PhD, so that's not an area I'm really an expert in. I do have a fair amount of friends who are working on getting theirs in IO psychology. So if you happen to come across this video and you're working on your doctorate in IO psychology, or you already have it, feel free to comment below and correct anything I'm saying. The first thing I would definitely say is to check out the SIOP website. That's Society for Industrial Organizational Psychology. That's going to give you an infinite amount more information than I ever could, but I also think the website can be a little bit overwhelming, so maybe first watch my video and then check it out. But they have a lot of information on master's versus PhD. But I would say the biggest difference between master's and PhD are 2 things. Number 1, the type of job you're gonna get afterwards, and then number 2, your salary. So according to the SIOP website, and it definitely holds true for myself and those I went to school with, 90% of master's level grads work as practitioners, 80% working in the private sector. So the most commonly reported industry for these was consulting organizations, which fits with what I do. So when they say private sector working consulting organizations, what essentially that's saying is that if you have your master's, you're generally not going off and working in academia. Often you're going to be working for an organization and either internally working with their employees, or you're an external consultant helping your clients' companies' employees. And generally with those master's level jobs, when it talks about that you work in industry as practitioners, what that often means really, really frequently is that you're working in HR at a company. And I think for some people that might sound a little bit surprising, but often when you're out in the working world, I think people, when they think of HR, they just picture someone who's firing people or hiring people, when that's maybe like 5% of what HR does. And there are a lot of different types of jobs within HR. And especially if you're looking at a lot of those big companies, a lot of those areas of specialization within certain types of HR jobs, a lot of those are IO psychologists. Whereas if you have your PhD, 18% work in consulting organizations and 31% work in doctoral universities. So I would say if your primary driver is you're really interested in research, if you're really interested in teaching or academia, then it makes a lot more sense to go for your PhD. The other reason you might want to go for your PhD is that your starting salary will definitely be quite a bit higher. So this is some really good data. You know, it's not surprising that SIOP has really good data around this since we study people at work. You know, we also study ourselves. So they send out a salary survey every year, and here are the 2020 numbers. So along the bottom, you can see average, you know, years since earning degree, and then you can see the difference for median incomes between a doctorate degree and a master's degree in IO psychology. So in general, if you're graduating with your master's and you have 2 years or less experience, you might be making around $70,000 versus 2 years out of your doctorate, you might be making around $90,000. So it looks like it's about a $20,000 a year difference in general. But keep in mind, this is going to vary so much. You know, maybe you went straight from undergrad to grad school, so you have essentially very few years of experience. Maybe you worked for 4 or 5 years and then you went to grad school, so your salary coming out of that might be a little bit higher. Also, of course, similar to any job out there, depending on if you work in the city versus out in the country, East Coast, West Coast, Midwest, all of those are going to impact it. Now I'm going to move on to talking a little bit about, and I think this will make everything I've said so far make a lot more sense, hopefully, but I'm going to talk about the different types of jobs you can get as an IO psychologist. And again, keep in mind, I have my master's, so I'm coming at it from that perspective. But when I mentioned earlier that a lot of IO psychology jobs are within HR, everything that I'm about to list in general at most companies, at least all the ones I've worked at and the ones all of my friends from school work at, all of these jobs I'm about to mention are actually within HR. But what I think makes it a little bit confusing is that you don't need necessarily an IO psychology degree to do these jobs. But within a lot of them, people do have IO psychology degrees. So I know a fair amount of my friends from school ended up going off and becoming HR business partners. I think that's the more common term. I think it's a little bit old-fashioned to be an HR generalist. I hear HR business partner a lot more often, but it's essentially the strategic HR person within, you know, either maybe for the whole company if it's smaller, or for one part of the company if it's larger. So they're partnering on compensation, recruiting, you know, retention, engagement, all of that stuff, anything to do with like the people side at work. Nothing against it. Like I mentioned, my very first job for my first rotation for 8 months, I was an HR business partner, and again, nothing against it, but I knew pretty quickly that was just not for me. Another main area, and I've never worked in this before, is compensation. So if you're interested in numbers, if you really like analytics, if you're great with all that stuff, that's a really, really, really great area to get into. Another main area would definitely be OD, or organizational development. So that gets into a lot of talent management, change management. A lot of OD, I feel like, tends to be external consultants. Then this is also a really, really fast growing area, and this is called different things depending on what company you look at, but either people analytics or HR analytics. So if you're really interested in data, if you love SPSS, SAS, HR, Excel, honestly, because a lot of companies just use Excel, Python, you know, if you're interested in any of those and you want to go into HR analytics, people analytics, data analytics, make sure you're picking a grad program that really, really emphasizes it, and it's not just 1 or 2 kind of basic entry-level courses. Then is learning and development, and I think the term people are probably more familiar with that isn't used as much anymore is training, or training and development. But learning and development, which is more or less basically, I think, what I mentioned before, what I do right now. It's a lot of creating and facilitating workshops and sessions, creating learning paths, creating career paths, all of that good kind of stuff. And then finally, and again, you'll notice this with a lot of, I keep saying this over and over again, it's called very different things company to company, which also makes, and I'll get into this in a little bit, job hunting really hard. But you've got sort of performance management, talent management, and a lot of what that can get into is the performance review process, goal setting process, executive coaching, all of that kind of stuff. I'm sure I probably missed some type of job in there, but when I mentioned earlier that a lot of IO psychologists don't walk around and call themselves IO psychologists, depending on what area they go into. They might say, I'm a compensation analyst, or I'm a learning and development specialist. You know, more often we'll say what our actual job title is at the company we're currently working at. And finally, the fun part, I'm being sarcastic, job hunting. I want to level set expectations. It is hard to find a job in IO psychology, just in the same way it's hard to find a lot of other jobs out there. I think unfortunately, when you look at like jobs on the rise list, IO psychology will often come up a lot, which is great to see, but I think it also gives off this false impression as if there are tons of these jobs out there and they're just, you know, you can snap them up super easily. I follow the IO Psychology subreddit, and that's another great place to get so many great tips, especially around schools, master's versus PhD, great place to go. But I do see a lot of people on there who say they're a year out of school and are still struggling to find a job. Luckily, everyone within my grad program had a job, I think within a year. Some people were coming up on that year mark, but luckily all of us got jobs within a year, because I will say the nice thing about an IO psychology degree is I mentioned all of those different types of jobs you can go into with it. So although if you type in IO psychology jobs in my area, not a lot might come up. If you type in, and this is one of my main tips, just go back and listen to again when I listed off all the types of jobs. And so for example, when I said talent management, type in talent management specialist, talent management consultant, talent management analyst, and do that for everything. Look at just a ton of different combination of words, because again, what makes this job confusing and hard to job hunt for is that it can be so many different jobs, and all of those jobs might be labeled different things company to company. I would also highly recommend joining IO psychology groups on LinkedIn within your area. So for example, if you're in Chicago, look up this Chicago IO psychology group. I'm sure that there's one out there, and you can connect with people, you know, network within your area virtually, since right now none of us are in person. Another idea is, say there's an opening at, I don't know, working at Google in IO psychology. Look on LinkedIn to see if there's anybody else from your grad program who also works there, and send them a, you know, really easy, quick, because, you know, people are busy. Send them a really quick LinkedIn message, connect with them, and say, hi, we haven't met, but we went to the same school. I'm thinking about maybe applying to a job also at your company. And you can just very, very simply say, do you enjoy working there? Do you like it? Because number one, you want to know that if the person actually does like working there and what the culture is like. But number two, again, people are busy. You don't want to message someone you don't know and ask them immediately, can you please take the time out of your day to refer a person you don't know? So just lob them a really easy softball and ask them if they're happy in their job. There's a lot of information. I'm a little bit out of breath, but I hope that this was helpful in case this is an area that maybe you're sitting around and you're thinking about applying to schools. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have down below. And also, if there are any videos that are related to IO psychology, I know I haven't filmed these psych pop videos in a while, but if you'd like me to film any videos on interviewing tips, presentation tips, networking tips, especially from the perspective of someone who's a big introvert like me, definitely feel free to let me know. Again, I hope you guys are doing well and staying safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.